Now for our new series. I want to focus on the great collectors of America, as I mentioned in my Art Brunch announcement. This is partly because I want to gauge interest in a art pilgrimage in the fall that goes to New York and Philadelphia and those areas to look at some of these incredible collections. So I want to start with J.P. Morgan. And the reason I want to start with J.P. Morgan is a pretty selfish one. I'm currently reading this book about the Morgan banking family. So he's been on my mind recently. So that is why I wanted to focus on him. Now, most people know John Pierpont Morgan as a Gilded Age banking tycoon and founder of the financial institution J.P. Morgan Chase. Some know him as the bibliophile responsible for creating the Morgan Library in New York City, which we'll discuss in a little bit. However, relatively few people realize that he was also the ultimate American art collector, using his vast wealth to purchase artwork on a scale only matched by Renaissance princes and Russian empresses. As president, donor, and de facto ruler of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Morgan shaped the United States' most significant art museum according to his own taste and vision. Much of his collection ended up there after his death. Pierpont Morgan was 52 years old when he sat for this portrait. The artist Frank Hole diverted attention from Morgan's skin condition, called rhinophyma, I think that's how it's pronounced, could be rhinophyma, which reddened and inflamed his nose. Some of you are familiar with pictures of him having this huge bulbous nose. The banker, though, was so fond of this particular portrait of him that he gave photographs of it to his friends, and it now hangs in the Morgan Library. Now, despite accumulating an art collection none of his countrymen could have dreamed of, more than 20,000 objects in only about 23 years of collecting, most people are completely unaware of his art legacy, which is extraordinary. His collection forms the foundation of many of our great institutions of art, like these museums. Now, what I found particularly strange in my research for this presentation is that scholars remain uncertain about Morgan's motives for collecting. But for me, looking at his collection, his motives are pretty clear. It was about his legacy. J.P. Morgan knew that people remember less one's financial accomplishments and more one's contributions to cultural enrichment. Just like the Medici family's legacy, a family he greatly admired. Morgan was a very patriotic man, and he felt it was his civic duty to bring world-class art to America, since he had the means to do so, far beyond any of his contemporaries. Other wealthy members of the Gilded Age felt the same, and we will explore their legacies in future presentations. The second half of the 19th century was an era where the United States still felt very culturally inferior to Europe and was doing everything it could to catch up and compensate. I mean, America couldn't compete with the Uffizi, the Louvre, or the National Gallery in London. So the idea of importing international art treasures to fill newly founded public cultural institutions like the Met appealed greatly to Morgan and other members of the Northeastern wealthy class. Now, this cartoon lampoons Morgan's efforts to enculturate America, but I, for one, am very glad for his efforts. I've enjoyed some of his treasures that he is responsible for that are at the Met currently. Now, surprisingly, Morgan did not become a serious art collector until he was in his 50s. Some people have suggested that the death of his father, Junius Spencer Morgan, in 1890, inspired this collecting boom, since the resulting inheritance gave the younger Morgan enough wealth to purchase pretty much any artworks he could have possibly wanted. Before he collected art, he had begun, though, his famous rare book and manuscript collection. The seed for all things classical, beautiful, and refined, however, was planted by this man, Junius, who sent his son to Europe for his education, where he remained through his teenage years. And while there, J.P. Morgan soaked in all the wonderful culture, visiting the great museums, libraries, and historical sites. Now it's time to just get a taste for some of that legacy that Morgan left us. This altarpiece is definitely one of the highlights of Morgan's art collection. Raphael's Colonna altarpiece. The Renaissance master Raphael painted the Colonna altarpiece around 1504, 1505 for a convent in Perugia. At one time, it was owned by Queen Christina of Sweden and later by the Colonna family in Rome. J. Pierpont Morgan acquired the altarpiece in 1901, paying for the time a phenomenal sum of 2 million francs. Morgan's son bequeathed the painting to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1916 and remains one of the great treasures of that collection. Morgan also loved the works of antiquity, particularly from the great empires of history. He purchased a set of Assyrian royal relief plaques from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II. Now notice so far, Morgan likes religious art, Renaissance art, and historical treasures like this relief. So Morgan is targeting what the great museums of Europe value most. He also targets the works of the great masters, like Vermeer. In addition, he purchased luxurious medieval ivories and enamels, Byzantine and early Christian objects, 18th century French and British paintings, European and Asian porcelains, Egyptian antiquities and tapestries, just to name a brief selection. Many of these objects can be seen here. Morgan's relationship with the Metropolitan Museum in New York City was a very close one that lasted for decades. During his lifetime, he had been a patron, a trustee, president, and essentially dictator of the museum. Naturally, he had a major impact on the direction that the institution took, using his wealth and influence to shape the institution according to his own vision. He wielded incredible power there and seems not to have had much tolerance for those who had differing visions for the museum. Part of this meant influencing the Met's own acquisition decisions during his lifetime, controlling which objects the museum would purchase with its own funds and others' donations, as well as donating objects himself. The Met, under his reign, did not purchase modern and contemporary art. That would come later from the Rockefeller influence. Now, Morgan never actually founded a museum of his own, but his son did so posthumously on his behalf, the famous Morgan Library. And here it is. On the left is the original Morgan Library, a repository for illuminated manuscripts, rare books, prints, drawings, and luxury objects related to the book arts, as well as tapestries. Both the palazzo-style architecture and richly painted and gilt interior decoration were inspired by the Italian Renaissance. The museum has since continued to build its collection and expanded its building with a Renzo Piano-designed modernist edition, which you see on the right. The museum's highlights include fabulously ornate medieval treasure bindings for religious manuscripts, a rare collection of Coptic manuscripts in their original bindings, several hundred etchings by Rembrandt, ancient Near Eastern cylinder seals, music manuscripts by some of the Western world's most famous composers, early printed books by Gutenberg, and an illuminated medieval Crusader Bible. We will look at some of these treasures in a moment. Now, credit for this assemblage goes not just to Morgan, but also to Belle de Costa Green, known as the soul of the Morgan Library, and a fascinating character in her own right. In 1905, she began her career as the personal librarian of J.P. Morgan. And here is the lovely view of the ceiling in her office. She must have had quite an office. And here is a photo of her when she was the library's first director from 1924 to 1948. Green had a family secret that she kept her entire life. She came from a prominent African-American family in Washington, D.C. Her father, Richard Greener, being the first African-American to graduate from Harvard. However, in order to enter, much less succeed in the lofty air of New York's elite at that time, she altered her name and passed herself off as Portuguese. Her light skin retained a hint of her racial identity, but being thought of as Portuguese, her complexion was seen as exotic. Now, I want to thank one of our members for this book recommendation I show you on the left, in case you want to learn more about this fascinating person. Green met Morgan through his nephew while working at the Princeton University Library. Starting out as Morgan's personal librarian and chief advisor, she became one of the most respected American librarians ever, a prominent society figure. Not only the Morgan family sought her expertise, Green also summered annually with the Vanderbilts in their cottages in Newport, Rhode Island. And I put cottages in quotes. Have any of you ever seen the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island? That's a Vanderbilt home, not really a cottage, I'd say. The library was as much Green's achievement then as it was Morgan's. And if you visit the library, you will see that it honors her legacy as well. Now take a moment to look at this portrait of Green. She was presented to the public, and I believe deliberately, as a white woman, without any hint of her true racial identity. Now, the Morgan family compensated her quite well for her efforts in building up the library and museum. I discovered this little news article, marveling at her $25,000 a year salary. Now, remember, this is the early 20th century, so $25,000 a year was quite a sum back then. Now, Morgan had a habit of purchasing entire collections at a time. He certainly did not buy indiscriminately, relying on the advice of Bella da Costa Green, as well as art advisors like the influential dealer Joseph Duveen and experts at the Met. By forging key relationships with wealthy American collectors like Morgan, Duveen would eventually bring thousands of artworks over from Europe, which went on to form the foundations of countless American museums. His strong opinions about what constitutes important art still inform the Western art canon and the art market to this day. Some of Morgan's collection, thanks to dealers like Duveen, was eagerly bought up by other ambitious art collectors, especially Henry Clay Frick, which we will learn more about next week. The Frick collection's famous Fragonard room, for example, had works that previously belonged to Morgan. And just catching a glimpse of these works, you can see Morgan's taste. Very classical, focused on beauty or historical significance. The Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, is in Morgan's birthplace. They also received a gift of more than 1,350 objects from his collection. So now on to his famous library and its collections. Morgan spared no expense, as you can see, in creating an opulent venue to display his collection of art and rare manuscripts. His voracious collecting was most intense from 1898 to 1906, when many old European aristocratic families were reeling from market crashes, and so they had to sell off their art collections. Morgan gobbled them up. In total, he amassed a collection of over 20,000 objects. These objects reflect nearly 5,000 years of human creativity. Just feast a moment on the elegant interior of this library and museum. Books, murals, stained glass, it's all there as a feast for the eyes and the mind. And now, what is in this library besides what you see on the walls and ceiling? Morgan collected ancient Assyrian and Babylonian seals and even published a book about his collection, in case some of you are nerdy about the subject. And Morgan definitely had a strong taste for religious art and liturgical objects like reliquaries and precious manuscripts, likely owing to his own deep Christian faith. Yes, he had a very deep Christian faith. His collection spanned objects created over, like I said, 5,000 years, except for modern art or art of the Americas from any era. For some reason, he had no interest. This exquisite reliquary supposedly contains a tooth from Mary Magdalene. And here is the front and back cover of one of the most famous manuscripts in the world. The Lindau Gospels ranks as one of the great masterpieces from the collection of the Morgan Library and Museum. It's named after the Abbey of Lindau on Lake Constance in Germany, where it was once housed, and contains the text of all four Gospels. Its jeweled covers constitute one of the most important of all medieval treasure bindings. Now, quite unusually, the manuscript's exquisite covers are in fact from entirely different regions and moments in time. The back cover is the earliest component of the book and was likely made in the region around Salzburg. It dates to the late 8th century. The front cover dates to nearly 100 years later, around 870 or so, and was likely produced in what is today Eastern France. The illuminated manuscript itself is still later. It was composed around 880 or 890 and was likely written and illuminated in the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland. So this work has quite a complex history. Here is another treasure from the library, the Stavelot triptych. I'd like to read directly from the description I found on the Morgan Library website for you. Here's what they say about this object. This glorious jewel-studded triptych, a work of art in 3 sections, was likely commissioned in the 1150s by the abbot of the Benedictine monastery of Stavelot in what is now Belgium, as a reliquary to hold fragments of the true cross, as well as relics from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and remnants from the Virgin Mary's dress. In the reliquary's central section are mounted 2 small Byzantine triptychs dating from the late 11th or early 12th century. The most sacred of the Christian relics, the fragment of the cross, is encased in the center of the lower triptych. It's decorated with 2 gold pins. They're in the shape of an X. You see that on the cross there? And 4 tiny pearls. Its 2 wings are adorned with figures of 4 Byzantine military saints, considered holy warriors. These flank the archangels Gabriel and Michael in glory over Emperor Constantine and his mother Helena, portrayed standing at either side of the cross. The smaller triptych above shows Christ on the cross, attended by the Virgin Mary at left, and St. John the Evangelist at right. Quite a lot going on in this little triptych. Morgan also purchased 3 Gutenberg Bibles, and here's one of them in a glass case. And with this tapestry hanging prominently above the library's fireplace, Morgan exhibited what I think is a rather self-deprecating sense of humor. Notice the title, The Triumph of Avarice, a deadly sin Morgan and all of his friends were pretty well acquainted with. Here's a close-up of the tapestry. Perhaps Morgan wanted the tapestry there to remind himself that his library and cultural gifts to the people of the United States must be used to atone for that particular sin of avarice. Now, this is the only surviving tapestry of a series of 7 depicting the 7 deadly sins by Peter Koch van Elst and woven in Brussels. The set was originally purchased by Henry VIII in the mid-1530s. So again, Morgan favors objects with historical significance. Morgan came by his love of art through the nurture of his family. I mentioned his father, but also his grandfather played a major role in the founding of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, which was where the Morgan family was from. Founded in 1842 and opened in 1844, it is the oldest continually operating public art museum in the United States. There is now a Morgan Memorial Building, which you see to the right of the original structure, which is part of the Wadsworth, built on land Morgan purchased for the expansion of the museum. Many items from Morgan's own collection would end up at the museum, over 1,400 objects. You can see Morgan's wing on the right there. Here is another view of the Great Hall in the Morgan wing. Again, notice the type of art on the walls. Very European, very classical. And as we know by now, Morgan also liked the great works of antiquity. Like many Americans and Europeans of the time, Morgan caught Egyptomania and collected many artifacts from the country. After his first visit in 1871, he returned several times, always adding to his growing collection, and many of those artifacts ended up in the Metropolitan Museum's collection. Morgan would also finance the Metropolitan's archaeological expeditions. However, the ones that you see here are in the Wadsworth collection. And here is a marvelous ivory sculpture in the Wadsworth collection. When Morgan purchased works such as this, I can't help but wonder if he not only had in mind the historical and aesthetic significance of such an object, obviously he did, but the meaning of it as well, the fall of man. Did Morgan feel a little guilty about his wealth, guilty about some of his business practices? Morgan's controversial legacy is best represented not by artwork, but by an economic event, the financial panic of 1907. Working out of his luxurious study in what's now the Morgan Library, J.P. Morgan orchestrated a resolution to this Wall Street crisis almost single-handedly. He gathered there the wealthiest bankers and locked them in a room, forbidding them to leave until they came up with a solution. Quite audacious. In averting a financial crisis, many felt Morgan exerted far more control over the national economy than any individual should. And Morgan did not hesitate to use the situation to his own immense financial benefit. At least that would be the case later on. But what happened actually, in fact, is President Teddy Roosevelt rewarded Morgan by breaking up the bank trusts. So Morgan, in saving America from the crisis, he suffered a little bit financially, at least temporarily. John Pierpont Morgan died in 1913 in Rome, Italy, of all places. His body was brought back to the States, to the family plots in Hartford. In his last will and testament, he stated, quote, "It has been my desire and intention to render my art collection permanently available for the instruction and pleasure of the American people, and have the Morgan Memorial, which forms a portion of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, utilized to effectuate a part of this purpose." Morgan's motives for collecting can be gleaned from what he collected. He wanted objects of historic significance that were sacred, after all, he was a devout Christian, that were elegant and beautiful and classical, values he embraced for himself. Regardless of our opinions about his business dealings, we can't deny that Morgan was extremely patriotic and worked to either establish or strengthen America's cultural institutions. So in closing, I would like to ask you, if you had Morgan's wealth, what legacy would you hope to create with it? With that question, I'll open it up for questions or comments. The floor is now open.